Well, I think they're regretting not making it happen now because there's no way that they could have seen how this one fight would reverberate into creating this entire card and bringing MVP into MMA and Netflix into MMA. I think because when I first sat down in that office and I was lactating, he didn't think I was to be taken seriously, but I'm be taken the most fucking seriously while I'm lactating.
Ronda Rousey sat down in front of cameras at the Most Valuable Promotions press conference and within the first 60 seconds had delivered the specific kind of statement that makes every person in the room understand that this is not going to be a standard promotional appearance where an athlete says the right things and everyone goes home with usable content. She referenced sitting in a UFC meeting while lactating, said they did not take her seriously in that moment, and then said with the calm certainty of someone who has been waiting to say this specific thing for a long time, that she should be taken most seriously while lactating, and the room understood immediately that the woman who had walked in was not the version that the UFC had managed for years. The corporate structure distinction she drew was the most strategically important thing she said all day, which was that her loyalty was to Dana White and the Fertitta brothers who built the original organization and gave her the platform that changed her life, and that she did not owe TKO's UFC a single thing because the entity they sold was not the entity she fought for when she was building the sport from the ground up. That separation, the personal loyalty from the institutional obligation, is not a semantic argument, but a deliberate and carefully constructed legal and moral position that removes her from the category of ungrateful athlete and places her instead in the category of someone who honored every commitment she made to the specific people she made it to, and now has no remaining obligation to the shareholders who bought the result of that work. The 100% finish rate line was the most surgical verbal attack delivered at the entire press conference, and it was not aimed at a journalist or at the UFC's corporate structure, but at the fighter who had called her ungrateful from his own YouTube channel, which was Khamzat Chimaev, who had spent the weeks before his title defense positioning himself as a UFC loyalist at the exact moment that positioning would cost him the most. She did not refer to him by his professional name, but by a dismissive nickname combined with a reference to a physical characteristic, and framed his entire criticism of her as the jealousy of a man whose own press conference was generating questions about her fight because nobody in the room was excited about his in the way they were excited about hers. The ineffectual wrestle characterization was a precision attack rather than a generic insult because it targeted the specific quality of his fighting style that the subsequent loss to Strickland had just made a subject of public debate, and the 100% finish rate comparison was accurate in the most devastating way, meaning it was not a boast, but a statistical argument that his own record could not refute. The additional irony that she did not need to state, because the internet had already assembled it for her, was that the man calling her ungrateful was the man who stood in the octagon after winning the championship and publicly demanded more money from Dana White on live television, which means the ungrateful characterization he chose for her was the exact one that his own documented behavior made impossible for him to sustain as a one-directional criticism.
I'd be open to continuing working with MVP and MMA, and I don't think it's just about women anymore. It's about all of us. And but I don't know. We'll see. I want to have a baby again real soon.
The arm-breaking question from the media was the moment that produced the most quotable 30 seconds of the press conference, because her answer was delivered with the casual pragmatism of someone who has been breaking arms for a living since 2010 and has developed a genuinely relaxed relationship with the concept. She said she would not hesitate to break it, but also would not hesitate to put it back, compared the process to wax on, wax off, clarified that what actually happens in a proper armbar is a dislocation rather than a break, and referenced her own experience of not tapping when she should have, and paying for that decision later in life as the specific evidence base for the observation that elbows are more forgiving than they appear in the moment. The casual confidence of that explanation is not performed toughness. It is the specific relationship with combat that athletes who have been doing this at the highest level for over a decade develop, where the things that terrify observers have been normalized by enough repetition that discussing them in a press conference requires no particular mental preparation. The Gina Carano dimension of the press conference added the counterpoint that the combat sports narrative structure requires, which was the softness to Rousey's hard angles, a genuinely emotional account of a comeback that had almost not happened due to health problems a year and a half before, and the declaration that it was already a victory before the first exchange, because the personal journey to standing on that stage had already cost everything it had available to cost. The apology to her fans was the moment that the people who had written the entire return off as a money grab and nothing more had the most difficulty incorporating into their framework, because a person performing a cynical commercial calculation does not need to express genuine remorse to a fan base for the years of absence and the difficult losses and the disappearance into professional wrestling and the silence that followed. She said she had so much appreciation and was sorry it did not always show, said she was happy to have their support back during what she believed was the beginning of something good rather than the tail end of something that had already happened, and the room's response suggested that the apology was received as genuine rather than as rehearsed damage control from a media team. The motivation question came directly after and produced the answer that redefined the entire press conference in a single sentence, because she did not defend herself against the money grab accusation by listing her passion for the sport or her desire to compete again. She redefined what greatness means in a way that made the accusation irrelevant to her framing entirely. She had already won 8 consecutive title fights, had already done everything the championship record books measure, and said her definition of greatness now included making history and having cultural impact and influencing the future, and that she and Gina Carano were smashing the record for the most women had ever been paid in combat sports, and that nobody had proven why that benchmark was less legitimate than the ones the sport had traditionally used to measure who mattered.
I just picture the fight and I can't see it going any other way. I want my hand raised. I want the comeback story, but of course this is a dream come true, and as sick as I was to be here a year and a half later, I feel like it's already a victory.
The "I am greatness" line is the one that traveled furthest after the press conference ended, and that will still be quoted when this chapter of the sport's history is being summarized. Not because of its audacity, which was considerable, but because it represented a genuine articulation of a self-concept that the sport had spent years trying to contain within the conventional fighter narrative, and that she was explicitly and permanently rejecting. She said she was not chasing greatness, that greatness was chasing her, and that the pursuit of it was something other people did while she existed as the thing they were pursuing. And the room's reaction to that specific statement was the kind of silence that happens when something lands precisely enough that the instinctive response is to let it sit for a second before responding. The vision she laid out for what comes after this fight, if the Netflix numbers justify the continuation, is the thing that the UFC's business team was paying closest attention to in real time, because a fighter who credibly positions herself as potentially the most powerful figure in the sport since Dana White is not describing a personal ambition, but a structural challenge to the market position that the UFC has held uncontested for 20 years. Whether the fight result validates the platform, or whether it becomes a data point that future promoters use to argue against this specific kind of return, the press conference itself had already produced something that results cannot retroactively erase, which is the public articulation of a framework for fighter power and fighter pay that landed on the same week as a UFC middleweight championship fight and generated comparable volume across the platforms that measure what the sport's audience is actually consuming and talking about. The Netflix dimension of what Rousey was describing is the specific variable that makes her claims about influence and power less audacious and more analytical than they appear on the surface, because a streaming platform with 325 million global subscribers hosting a combat sports event changes the reach calculation for any fight it puts on its platform in ways that the UFC's existing distribution structure cannot match simultaneously. The combination of most valuable promotions with Jake Paul and Nikisa Bidarian, Netflix reach, a recognizable name in Rousey at the top of the card, and additional fighters including Francis Ngannou and Nate Diaz and Mike Perry across the rest of the card, was a proof of concept designed to answer one specific business question, which was whether a viable alternative to the UFC could generate the kind of commercial attention that forces the negotiating dynamics in the sport to shift. The fighter pay argument that underpins the entire Rousey return is not new and is not unique to her, but what is new is the specific combination of a former champion who was credible enough to build the UFC's women's division from zero, willing enough to say the specific things that fighters currently under contract cannot say, and positioned on a platform large enough to make those statements reach the people whose decisions determine whether the argument produces structural change or remains a media cycle. The press conference ended with a version of Ronda Rousey that was coherent across every statement she made, from the lactation comment to the 100% finish rate to the loyalty distinction to the I am greatness declaration, which is the specific quality that distinguishes a person who has thought carefully about what they want to communicate from a person who is performing a media character. And whether the fight and the platform and the numbers justify what she is building is the question that the sport now has to watch play out in real time with no ability to control the outcome.
I could become the face of MMA, the face of MVP in MMA, and the most powerful figure in the sport since Dana. I'm not chasing greatness. Motherfucker, I am greatness. They're chasing me. And is making history, having a cultural impact, and influencing the future of the sport. I've already won a record 8 consecutive title fights. There's nothing left for me to do there. So now, me and Gina are smashing the record for the most women have ever been paid in combat sports. And who's to say we can't